C-SPAN Now, your front row seat to Washington, anytime, anywhere.
Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back to Washington Journal. We're joined now by Bradley Bowman. He is a senior director at the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Brad, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again.
So your reaction to the recent escalation in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas and now Hezbollah?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's good to join you. It's been a very significant week in the Middle East. Back on last week and on Saturday, we saw a strike launched from Hezbollah-controlled territory in southern Lebanon using a ground-launched short-range rocket that killed 12 children on a soccer field in the Golan Heights, and more than 50 people were injured. This was the most significant single incident loss of life in Israel since the October 7th terror attack. And so it was clear that Israel would need to respond. And so on Tuesday, Fuad Shukr, a senior Hezbollah commander, was killed in Lebanon. And a lot of your viewers may be interested to know that he was involved with the 1983 bombing in Beirut that killed 241 service members and many others. And actually, there was a $5 million rewards for justice bounty out for him. So the Israelis, I would say, brought justice to him. And a lot of American service members and veterans are not shedding any tears about him being taken off the battlefield. And then on that same day, on Tuesday, the Israel Defense Forces confirmed that Mohammed Deif, a leading Hamas military commander, had indeed been killed last month. And so they confirmed that on the same day that Fuad Shukr was taken off the battlefield. And of course, on Wednesday, Ismail Haniyeh, the top political leader of Hamas, just a short time after he was attending the inauguration for the new Iranian president, was killed reportedly in the New York Times and elsewhere by a bomb that had been placed in his room in an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps hotel, if you will, weeks in advance, and then was remotely detonated, and he died. So it was not a good week for Hamas and Hezbollah terrorist leaders.
What difference does this actually make? Or is Israel essentially playing whack-a-mole, right? You take out one leader, there's three that are ready to take his place.
It's really a great question, and it reminds me of the American experience in fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS, for example. Some leaders are more important than others. Some leaders are easier to replace than others. I would say this is very significant politically, for sure. Ismail Haniyeh, he was not involved in the day-to-day military operations in Gaza. Mohammed Deif was a much more significant target in that respect. The most important Hamas terrorist leader remaining is Yahya Sinwar, and he's most likely in a terror tunnel in Gaza right now, and he is the person, Yahya Sinwar is, who is going to be deciding almost certainly on any sort of ceasefire. So these are significant politically. The killing of Haniyeh is a major embarrassment to the Islamic Republic of Iran because it occurred in Tehran, just as I said, a few hours after he had attended inauguration in an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps facility. And it appears that the Israelis did this with precision and ease.
Well, you mentioned the ceasefire talks. Yeah. Haniyeh was instrumental, or at least central, to those talks. What happens now that he's gone? Yeah,
I think Yahya Sinwar is the most important individual here. And one can imagine at least two motives here that might be on his mind. One is that he's seen a lot of his fellow Hamas leaders being killed. But on the other hand, I think that Sinwar probably likes what he's seen. By that I mean he's wanted to have a regional war against Israel his whole life. This has been his goal. His ultimate goal, let's just be blunt, is the extermination of the Jewish state of Israel. That's his goal. Read Hamas's charter. They're quite clear on that, their original charter. Look at what they did on October 7th. Their intentions are clear. And so now he has this so-called axis of resistance, I'd call it an axis of terrorists, where Hamas is being joined by Hezbollah and the Houthis and groups in Syria and Iraq, all part of this ring of fire around Israel. And so I'd say even though Hamas has had a tough time and many of their forces have been decimated since October 7th, from his perspective as someone, he sees himself as an historic figure, and he, generally speaking, is probably happy with the regional developments, and that from his perspective, Israel is more under threat, more isolated and more demonized than he's seen in many years from his perspective.
So from your perspective, how likely is it that this spirals into a much bigger regional war?
You know, it's a good question. After October 7th, Hezbollah, the Islamic Republic of Iran varsity terrorist proxy in Lebanon, started attacking Israel on an almost daily basis. Since October 8th, those attacks have increased in frequency, in severity. They've gone deeper into both Lebanon and Israel as they've traded fire. And maintaining this this kind of tenuous dance of trying, dance is not the right word, we're talking about life and death decisions here, is difficult to maintain. And then you have things like this happen where you have these 12 children killed, and then you have stronger and stronger responses. And so following the killing of Hania in Iran, it is quite clear to me that we're going to see a major response from Iran. My best guess, and this is a guess, would be that this attack would come from Hezbollah, from the Houthis, from groups in Iraq and Syria, and potentially from Iran itself. Some of the comments of Iranian leaders suggest, like we saw on April 13th, which was the first time ever we saw an attack directly from Iranian soil against Israel, almost 350 munitions launched toward Israel. Thankfully, most of them did not get through. One poor Bedouin girl was injured. It was largely unsuccessful, but they were trying to kill people. So I think there's a strong likelihood we could see in the coming days, probably after the mourning period is over for Hania, that we could see a massive attack that could be bigger than what we saw on April 13th. And we're seeing reporting that thankfully the Biden administration, the Department of Defense, is maneuvering forces to help defend the state of Israel.
If you'd like to join us and ask a question, make a comment for our guest, Brad Bowman of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, you can give us a call by party. Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. I wonder what you think of the U.S.'s influence in trying to prevent that larger war. Does the U.S. have any sway?
The U.S. has a huge amount of sway because Israel relies on the United States of America for diplomatic support and for security assistance. Following October 7th, the Biden administration, President Biden himself, I think the week after that terror attack, which was the largest single-day murder of Jews since the Holocaust, was one of his strongest weeks. He stood with Israel rhetorically, and then he backed it up with actions by sending an extraordinary amount of weapons to Israel to help them defend themselves. And so, because of historical ties, the U.S. has a lot of influence with Israel on Israel's decision-making. But I would say, unfortunately, in recent weeks, the Biden administration's influence has been unhelpful. And what I mean by that is what we see kind of happening over and over again is that the Islamic Republic of Iran and its terror proxies attack Israel. And then the Biden administration, I'd say in a good intention desire to avoid a regional war, applies pressure, both private and public pressure on Israel to not respond or to respond in a reduced way. Take the win was the phrase after the April 13th and 14th attack. The problem is if you just think about this logically or think about it in a playground context, if Israel's enemies can rely on the United States to constantly apply pressure on Israel not to respond strongly, and they can rely on Washington trying to apply that pressure on Jerusalem, then it simply is going to invite more attacks on Israel. So there's a negative dynamic here that develops, and that's why I think when your best friend in the region, your best, most capable friend in the region, is having among the worst days of its life, you're very careful what you say publicly because you don't want to empower Israel's enemies in this moment.
Do you think that there can be a coordinated attack then from, as you said, directly from Iran? Then you've got Hezbollah on the northern front of Israel. You've got the Houthis to the south. You've got Gaza still going on. Would Israel be able to repel that kind of a coordinated attack?
Yes, I think you could see. Yes, you could see a coordinated attack. That's what we saw on April 13th. And if you force me to predict, I would say we would see a coordinated attack again, potentially from Iran, from Lebanon, from the Houthis. What's left of Hamas will try to launch a few rockets as well, also from Iraq and Syria. And you could also see some things in the West Bank as well. So we're talking about a 6 or 7 front war here for the state of Israel, a state the size of New Jersey. who's gotten effectively smaller because more than 60,000 Israelis have been evacuated from their homes in the north. This is a scary time for Israel, and it's a time, in my view, for the United States to stand with our ally in its moment of need. And so, yes, this could happen. And I could see an Iranian logic that, hey, on April 13th, we launched nearly 350 munitions. It was largely it was a political win, I would say, for Iran. It was militarily unsuccessful. So I could see Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps leaders advising the supreme leader that, hey, if we're going to do it this time, let's do more, because we want to have more of these munitions get through the formidable Israeli air and missile defense system and any help they would receive from the United States.
Well, President Biden briefly addressed the situation in the Middle East while speaking to reporters at Joint Base Andrews. Here's his remarks.
I'm very concerned about it. I had a very direct meeting with the Prime Minister today, and very direct. We have the basis for a ceasefire. He should move on it, and they should move on it now.
Is the chance for a ceasefire ruined after the assassination of Haniya?
It's not helped.
He said that the prospects of a ceasefire was not helped by the assassination of Haniya. Do you agree with that?
No, and I think that's an unhelpful thing for the President of the United States to say. This Haniya is a stone-cold murderer terrorist. Hamas is a foreign terrorist organization. Americans were killed on October 7th. Americans are being held in hostages in dungeons in Gaza. This is the President of the United States. He should be so proud of bringing Evan, Paul, and Alsu home, these hostages. We should not be mourning the death of a stone-cold terrorist murder. We should be celebrating it. The Israelis have brought justice to an enemy of the United States in Iran and an enemy of the United States in Lebanon and in Hamas in Gaza. We should be applauding that, not condemning that. And when our enemies fear us and Israel, we deter a future aggression. So I think President Biden respectfully got it exactly wrong there.
Let's talk to callers and start with Bo, an independent in Sylvester, Georgia. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm glad that your guest is on there. I've been watching events in the Middle East for years, and I know you've talked about this conflict between Iran, Hezbollah, and Israel. There's also some news reports that Turkey, which is a NATO ally of the United States, could possibly get involved if Israel goes into Lebanon. They come through Syria. And he probably realizes this also. We're on the 50th anniversary that Turkey invaded Cyprus, which used American weapons against Greeks living on the island. I want to know what your perspective would be if Turkey should get involved. What would happen when we have to confront them as well, even though they're a NATO ally? Thank you.
Thank you for the call. Yes, Turkey is a NATO ally. But sometimes Turkey doesn't act like an ally, in my view. They do things like purchasing the S-400 air and missile defense system from Russia, the leading threat to the NATO alliance. So if you're a NATO member, you probably shouldn't be buying an air defense system from the leading threat to the alliance. So that's unhelpful. And of course, Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, is an Islamist and meets regularly with some of these terrorists and has played an incredibly unhelpful role not becoming of a NATO ally since October 7th. And so I have concerns about Turkey, but I do not envision them taking military action against Israel. If they did, I think the United States would have something to say about that.
And Ted is in Ocean View, Hawaii, Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I've been watching for many years, and I heard a caller a few moments ago say we should not think and just take action, and I think this fellow, Bradley Bowman here, could comment on the fact that you really do need to think and not just act. Some people think you just need to rush in and act, and that could be very dangerous. That's my point.
Thank you, sir, for the call and for the point. I agree with you. As a student of history and strategy, history is replete of examples of the following lesson, and that is that wars are easy to start and hard to end. And so I think we should bring great scrutiny to with military withdrawals, as we argued in our as former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta argued in a December 2020 monograph that I edited. He's on our board of advisors. And we should also breed scrutiny to starting wars. But sometimes you have to fight, but before you start a fight, you want to think clearly, make sure that you're prepared, not for not only what you're going to do, but how your adversary is going to respond. And you better believe Israel, for example, is preparing for this response that I just described earlier, as is the United States, and that's exactly what you'd want our military and the Israeli military to be doing.
I want you to comment on this news, which is about 9/11 mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and 2 others charged in terror plot reach plea deals. It says that the terms of the plea deals for the 3 men were not released, but they are expected to plead guilty to some charges and potentially avoid death sentences as a result.
Yeah, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was one of the masterminds of the 9/11 terror attacks that killed nearly 3,000 people. He is another stone-cold terrorist. He has been at Guantanamo for many years. It's taken a long time to move the process forward. We had the Department of Defense put out a press release where they said that some sort of pretrial agreement had been reached. We learned later via reporting from a letter from the prosecutors to the 9/11 family that he apparently has agreed to plead guilty in return for a life sentence to avoid a death penalty trial. Some of the concerns associated with the death penalty trial was that it could last a long time, and it was possible that the judge might throw out the confession based on the fact that it may have been obtained via torture. And so the prosecutors in their letter to the 9/11 family said they felt like this is the best path forward to trying to finally bring justice to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I would just add one statistic, one side note, is that the Biden administration, not unlike the Obama administration previously, was very eager to close Guantanamo and to do that, try to move the detainees out and elsewhere. And it was on the path to do that, reportedly, with roughly 11 more when October 7th happened, and then changed their mind after that. And this is something that I worked very closely for years in the U.S. Senate when I was National Security Advisor to Senator Kelly Ayotte. According to the most recent statistics I found, 32%, almost 32% of Guantanamo detainees that are released are confirmed or suspected of returning to terrorism. And a lot of people, expressing opinions about this don't understand the difference between our military detention justice system and our Department of Justice civilian justice system. The latter is focused on justice. The former is focused on keeping combatants off the battlefield. And as long as the conflict continues under international law and law of war, you can keep people detained. And so it's an important distinction. A lot of people are bringing DOJ arguments to something that is quite different in the military justice system.
All right, let's talk to John in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Democrat. Hi, John.
Good morning, Bradley. Earlier, you said it was an embarrassment for Iran to be struck by Israel. And I just wonder why it's an embarrassment for a country, a sovereign country, to not be prepared for another country to attack their property, which is an act of war generally. And this is the second time Israel has escalated like this when they attacked, I believe it was a consulate or an embassy of Iran in another country, which is, again, an act of war. And if someone did that to the U.S., we would be responding hard. And about the 11 Druze children, or 12, I don't want to discount that, but Euromed, and this is on the State Department website, released an article about how there were 237 Palestinians killed in conflict-related violence prior to October 7th in the West Bank in 2023. So my question is, what are you talking about the Palestinians doing all this? Israel has been oppressing the Palestinians for 75 plus years, and Israel has constantly been bombing what? They've bombed 4 to 7 countries since October 7th. Does that sound like a peaceful nation, or does that sound like an aggressor?
All right, John, let's get a response.
Thank you for the call. A lot of content there. I'll try to be quick. Why did I say it was an embarrassment for the Islamic Republic of Iran that Hania was killed? Pretty straightforward, I think. It was the killing occurred in the capital of Tehran. It occurred reportedly in an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps hotel. and it occurred about a couple hours after Hania attended the inauguration for the new Iranian president. But I would say you kind of suggested that there was something wrong with that. I'd be interested to know, sir, whether you thought the United States should have gone after Osama bin Laden after 9/11. I think that was absolutely the right thing to do. He's a combatant who murdered 3,000 American citizens. On October 7th, proportionally, that was some combination of 9/11 and Pearl Harbor for Israelis, and on a per capita basis was far greater number of people killed on October 7th than we had on 9/11. So what exactly would you expect Israel to do after the worst single-day murder of Jews since the Holocaust? Just sit on their hands and do nothing? No, of course not. They're going to go after the Hamas leaders. The long tradition of Nazi hunting, for example. This is the same sort of ideology, the idea that they want to kill Jews. Read the Hamas charter. They want to exterminate the state of Israel and kill Jews. Look at some of the propaganda, the sick propaganda that some of the Hamas fighters left with them, that was found on the Hamas fighters on October 7th, talking about Jews as people that need to be eliminated because there's something wrong with them. So, are you suggesting that Israel should not be going after the leaders who committed the atrocities of October 7th? I don't really understand that argument, and I'm wondering whether you would apply that same logic to going after Osama bin Laden after 9/11. And you're talking about innocent Palestinians being killed. I think every individual, regardless of their background, who's innocent, who's killed, is an absolute tragedy. And the thing to remember is that there was peace on October 6th. There was a ceasefire. Israel was of the mind that Gaza was basically settled. One of my colleagues was talking to an Israeli leader a couple of weeks before October 7th. They had an hour-long conversation about threats to Israel. At the end of it, my colleague said, hey, you didn't mention Hamas. What's up with that? He's like, hey, we think Hamas basically is happy with the status quo. They're looking for peace. They're not looking for a major war. Israeli leaders, frankly, were completely duped. They weren't looking for a war in Gaza. Hamas chose to break the ceasefire, chose to commit this atrocity, and now they're paying the price.
All right, and Michelle is in Longwood, Florida, Republican. Hi, Michelle.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay. So my question is that I was going to ask particularly about how you think Trump would handle this differently. But really, my question is that over the course of history, since Israel was created, is there not a pattern in which there's no peace about this, because nothing was ever really settled about what to do about the Palestinians as a group of people? Since there was the UN really displaced that set of people to create Israel, and there was no reconciliation for them, in addition to which the Arab nations didn't step up for them either. So I don't disagree that Israel should have been created. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that there's a disproportionate result of that is continuing to play out without resolution, no matter if there's ceasefires or broken ceasefires. There's continual disproportionate disadvantage that's not been settled. How do you think the Republicans across time handled it differently than the Democrats?
All right, Michelle.
That's a great question, Michelle. I think we need about an hour to address all your good questions there, but I'll try to be very quickly. So how would Trump handle this differently in a second term? It's a good question. People could disagree on this. I think generally speaking, we would probably see a more assertive provision of weapons to Israel in a Trump administration than we've seen with Biden. I said earlier that they provide an extraordinary amount, but I would flag that right now the Biden administration is holding one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel out of concerns related to Rafah, which frankly are no longer relevant. And there's also some reason to believe that the Biden administration may be delaying congressional notification for multiple other systems that Israel would need for a major war with Hezbollah and Iran, which is incredibly unhelpful, and again, kind of putting Israel at unnecessary risk. I don't think you would see that in a second Trump term. And so I think you probably wouldn't see the same public criticisms of Israel from Trump. But President Trump also, brags about not starting wars, and that's good. We don't want to start wars. But if you keep saying, as President Biden has been saying, we don't want a regional war, we don't want a regional war. Anyone who's been on a playground understands if you keep saying to the bully, I don't want to fight, I don't want to fight, what does the bully do? He punches you in the mouth again. So I think we would see some things from my perspective that would be better in the Trump administration, but maybe not as good as many people think.
Brad Bowman, you mentioned the U.S. withholding 2,000-pound bombs from Israel. Are those types of bombs really necessary for that war in Gaza, or are they just too destructive in an urban environment, and you are definitely going to have a lot of civilian deaths?
Thanks for the question. So the U.S. military has used 2,000-pound bombs in urban environments. There are, from a military perspective, legitimate uses of those, and from a humanitarian perspective, there are. What's an example of that? If you've cleared all the civilians out of an urban area, which Israel repeatedly has tried to do, and you have buried beneath large buildings terrorists, you have two options. You either send infantrymen into those tunnels, many of whom will die trying to get them, or after you've cleared the civilians out of the area, you can use the 2,000-pound bomb. So there are some legitimate reasons why you would do that. A lot of the reporting regarding the use of 2,000-pound bombs in Gaza in places like the New York Times has been incredibly sloppy, not considering soil, fuses, all sorts of things. But the short answer to your question is no, I don't see a lot of need now for 2,000-pound bombs in Gaza. I don't think they need them right now. But my point that I'm making is they held it out of concerns weeks ago about Rafah. That's no longer an issue. Israel doesn't need 2,000-pound bombs in Gaza anymore, to answer your question. But they do need them for Hezbollah, because Hezbollah has lots of terror tunnel twos, and a lot of them are deeply embedded in rock.
This is in Lebanon.
In Lebanon, as opposed to Gaza, exactly. And I am concerned that you have other munitions. I'm talking about not only bombs, but guidance kits and fuses that are not being noticed to Congress. And those guidance kits, let's be clear, that helps Israel hit the bad guys and save innocent lives. And some of the munitions that may not be noticed to Congress are ones that are penetrators, which are designed to go and blow up underground, which means you get the bad guys and you protect innocent people. So it's kind of a perverse logic. Like, why would you withhold the things that allow them to minimize civilian casualties?
Let's go to St. Petersburg, Florida on the independent line. Lana, good morning.
Good morning, Mimi. Good morning, Mr. Bowen. I would like to ask one question. It's a great thing that we have our prisoners back, but all the other prisoners that are in all the other countries, how do we keep them from coming back? I'll take my answer offline. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for the call and the question. I'd say it's just absolutely heartwarming and wonderful to see these 3 Americans returning home last night. I watched it live on television like a lot of Americans did, and I think any patriotic American just should feel wonderful about that our government cares and takes action to try to bring you home. And and this is something service members kind of rely on when they're deployed into harm's way, and American civilians benefit from that well. So welcome home to Evan, Paul, and Alsu. And there are also 16 total prisoners freed, and Vladimir Kara-Murza was freed. That's great. And so I think that's just wonderful. Unfortunately, a lot of, all of these individuals that were detained in Russia were wrongfully detained and were innocent, despite what Vladimir Putin and his regime said. But unfortunately, to get them home, we had to release a lot of real deal criminals and killers, frankly, including one individual who assassinated someone in a park in Berlin and was convicted and serving time in Germany. And so I do worry that this incentivizes more hostage taking, where we're going to be swapping stone cold convicted criminals, killers, and terrorists for innocent people. But the bottom line is that 3 Americans are home, and that's a wonderful thing.
So what should Israel give up in exchange for the hostages that are still being held?
I would recommend, if asked, to Israel that you take all reasonable measures to try to achieve a temporary ceasefire that brings the hostages home, that provides a little breathing space for Israel to stockpile munitions, to prepare its forces for a larger war with Hezbollah that could come. and to frankly reduce the temperature in the bilateral relationship with the United States.
Why would Hamas accept that, knowing that this is a temporary ceasefire? I'm going to release the hostages. I won't have a bargaining chip anymore. And now Israel gets a chance to restock.
I'm not sure why they would accept that, because
they haven't.
Right, and they haven't. And that, everyone, how many times in the last few weeks says, ceasefire is pending. And I always look at that with a little bit of a John Decide, right? Because the implication behind your good question, that is, Yahya Sinwar, the remaining most important leader of Hamas in Gaza, is probably hiding in a tunnel in Gaza, and he's probably surrounded himself with these poor hostages, knowing that, unlike Hamas, Israel values human life and doesn't want to kill its own citizens. And so he's using them as human shields, which is, of course, a practice that Hamas has perfected. And one of the reasons why we've seen so many casualties in this war, because they deliberately put launch sites in schools and command nodes in hospitals to, frankly, I'm using my words carefully and deliberately based on research, to invite attacks where innocent people die so that they then can blame that on Israel for the purpose of demonizing and isolating Israel in a political warfare campaign.
And Sinwar himself was released from an Israeli prison in a prisoner swap.
Right, right, and exactly. And so you have these instances where Israel has very much based on the same values and principles that we saw on display here with, bringing Evan, Paul, and Alsu home, is that we value human life, every individual matters, and so we've had instances where Israelis have traded hundreds of prisoners for just one Israeli, and that says something about, I think, their view of human life.
Let's talk to Jim in Parsons, West Virginia, Democrat. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning. Good morning. I just wanted to ask this fellow some questions and point out some things. And thank goodness that guy called from Minnesota a few callers back. He illustrated some key points. I think it's ridiculous first of all, I think it was ridiculous for your guest to portray President Biden as being sympathetic or grieving, the death of a terrorist. He wants to see a ceasefire there. And if you look at cause and effect, like the guy from Minnesota was calling and asking about, was how long has Israel tried to maintain the Palestinian areas as it's like blockaded. It said for 75 years or whatever. It's like they have to exist in a prison. How can people say, why don't they develop? Why don't they do progressive and good things? And how many thousands of Palestinians are in prisons? The guy, the chief of the United Nations, said the day after that all happened, of course it's terrible. You hate to see terror. But he said it didn't happen in a vacuum. When you have people oppressed, downtrodden, and they feel like there's no hope, you're going to have things like that. And
all right, Jim, let's get a response. What are the prospects for a long-term solution for Palestinians?
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for the call. Just real quick, I want to be clear. I don't think I said in any way that President Biden was grieving the loss of the death of Hania or was in any way sympathetic to Hania. I don't think I said that at all. What I said was that I thought that his comment that the killing of Hania was unhelpful was not helpful. That's what I said. So President Biden, I think, is a good man that sometimes has misguided policies and makes poor statements. And I think that was one of them. But he is a good man, and I think he sees terrorism clearly. So it's important that you heard me correctly on that. I think the primary reason a lot of people want a two-state solution, I think the primary reason from my perspective that we don't have a two-state solution, which has been on offer in the past, go back and look at some of the discussions at Camp David, look at some of the opportunities in the past. The primary reason, not the only reason, the primary reason you don't have a two-state solution is because of groups like Hamas. And when Americans sit in safety and comfort and talk about, we need a two-state solution following October 7th, to many Israelis that I talk to, that is just absolutely tone deaf, because from their perspective right now, if you were to provide a two-state solution, it would simply provide a more effective launching pad for the next October 7th. I mean, if you're a country the size of New Jersey and you have people all around you that want to kill you and don't recognize your right to exist, If you give them more power, they're going to more effectively kill you. So there's an argument that a two-state solution could provide that hope and provide Palestinian self-determination, and that would be a good thing. But we're farther now from a two-state solution than we were on October 6th, and that's Hamas's fault. You want a two-state solution? You want Palestinian determination? You have to deal with the sick ideology behind groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas first. And until you do that, I don't think you're going to have a two-state solution.
Great, all the trees.
Damien in Laurel, Maryland, Republican. Damien?
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Hey, I want to know a couple things I want to understand about. I want to understand Israeli politics. It's like ours, right? I mean, you got the far left, you got the far right, you got the middle. And how's that working out now? Why are people in Israel actually protesting their own government? Because their government is trying to support them through annihilating Hamas. I don't get it. Now, these college students that protest here, I call them a bunch of weenies. Netanyahu called them useful idiots, and that's what they are. They have no idea what real struggles the Israelites are going through right now. You know, after they protest on campus, you know, they get a little tired. They go get their double oat milk lattes, and, you know, they're really struggling out there. But I believe I heard Netanyahu's speech. I really agreed with it. Annihilation, that's the future of Hamas. Annihilation is the future of all these terrorist groups. That is the only option. And once they understand that, and the Palestinians see there's no future with Hamas, the liberal Palestinians will say, hey, let's live a better life for our children. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for the call. Two main issues there. I hear what's going on with Israeli politics and Israelis protesting their own government. You know, it's called democracy, I'd say. And Israel arguably is the only democracy in the Middle East. So when you see Israelis disagreeing with one another, exercising their rights, criticizing their own government, sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? It sounds like American democracy, and I'd say that's healthy and good. And what a distinction between some of the other regimes we see in the region, and between the kind of authoritarian, totalitarian world that Hamas and its co-laborers would implement. So I'd say some of the domestic turmoil that we saw before October 7th with the judicial reform, some of the things, frankly, we see on the far right in Israeli politics are incredibly unhelpful to Israel, and I'd say to American interests. But I'd say in democracies, a diverse, rambunctious democracy like Israel, like the United States, disagreement and expressing your viewpoints is a good thing. You mentioned the protesters here in the United States. You know, speaking of freedoms, I celebrate the rights of free speech and protest, peaceful protest. Unfortunately, a lot of what we saw on campus was broke the law, and there was a failure to impose consequences. And just a short distance from here, I hope Americans saw what happened in front of Union Station. I hope you saw the graffiti that the protesters said that they love Hamas and they called for the annihilation of Israel and said horrible things about Jews, and also a lot of the anti-American comments there. And I would flag, not only did they burn an American flag there at Union Station, just a few hundred feet from here, they also defaced the American Legion Freedom Bell. Did you see that? And then who got to go clean it up? The National Park Service. It took them multiple days to do it, trying to clean up some of this graffiti, and they couldn't clean it off. And so what's the point there? The point there is that these groups that are anti-Semitic and anti-Israel consistently are also anti-American. What's the point there? My point there is that Israel is fighting America's enemies, and we are foolish not to provide them the means to go after our common adversary.
Brad Bowman, I want to ask you about Iraq. The Washington Post is reporting that the U.S. military has launched first airstrike in Iraq in months. It says that the operation south of Baghdad targeted unspecified combatants and followed attacks on U.S. forces in recent days. What's happening in Iraq?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you asked that, because we've been talking a lot about what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon and Israel, and it's important to not miss that we have our fellow citizens in harm's way, American service members, about 2,500 U.S. service members in Iraq, about 900 in Syria. And they're not there on a vacation. They're there to help keep the ISIS caliphate defeated. That's why they're there. We've had, since July 16th, about 5 attacks on our forces, including roughly 2 in Iraq and 3 in Syria. And then we had this response by the Department of Defense where they took out a one-way attack drone that was that the Department of Defense believed was going to be trying to do another attack against our forces. Here's the broader zoom-out point that I would flag for everyone, is that from October 17th to February 4th, Iranian proxies in Iraq and Syria attacked our U.S. forces 165 times. 165 times from October 17th to February 4th. How many times did we respond? 9. A lot of people, including myself, are saying that if we didn't respond more frequently and more strongly, that those attacks would continue and sooner or later Americans would die. Horribly, sadly, that's exactly what happened on January 28th in Jordan at Tower 22, where 3 U.S. service members were killed. How did the Biden administration laudably and belatedly respond? We hit 85 targets, and a few days later we killed the leader of Kataib Hezbollah. What was the result of that? The attacks essentially stopped on our forces. We had only 2 attacks in 22 weeks. So 165 attacks in 15 weeks, and then following a strong response, 2 attacks in 22 weeks. What's the point? American weakness invites aggression. American strength, our adversaries, the Islamic Republic of Iran, its terror proxies, tend to back down. Let's hope the Biden administration is taking notes, because I do worry that we're going to see more attacks on our forces in Iraq and Syria in the coming days.
Let's talk to Bradley in Marietta, Georgia, Democrat. Hi, Bradley.
Yes, I'm old enough to remember when Benjamin Netanyahu came and told us that without a doubt, 100%, there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, the Israelis had the attack plans for October 7th, a year in advance. It took them 12 hours to respond. Basically, my point is Benjamin Netanyahu is an absolute just piece of crap, man. He will do anything that he has to do to stay in power, and I feel like it's like repeating itself again. They are absolutely dragging us into a war with Iran, and this is the Persian Empire. This is not Iraq. If we go to a war with Iran, this is going to be an absolute just disaster for the planet. And I just feel like this, same name as me, but this dude is a bloodthirsty, just. If you want to have terrorism, what we're doing and what Israel is doing to Palestinians, we will have this for decades to come. It's not like we don't want to appease, terrorists, but I just feel like Israel is just making us have no response but to go to war and deal with their enemies. And it's the far right. It's not the whole state of Israel. And Israel's not a democracy. You cannot be a Jewish state and a democracy, because if you're not a Jewish person in that country, then you don't have the same rights. I really fear that we're going down the same road, and Benjamin Netanyahu will do anything to not have to go to jail.
All right, Bradley.
A lot of content there. I'm so glad you mentioned Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran is the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism. They continue to earn that title, and they're inching toward a nuclear weapon. They're the puppet master behind these puppet proxy attacks on Israel. They're very happy to have Israel and the United States focusing on Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, while letting the puppet master just kind of sit back unscathed in Iran, smiling. So I think, generally speaking, from the Islamic Republic of Iran, this is going very well. We're not talking about Iran's nuclear program. We should be. And they're trying to stoke division between Arabs, Americans, and Israelis because, like a bully on the playground, they want to divide their adversaries and conquer them one by one. You suggest that Iran is just Israel's problem. I think that's fundamentally misguided. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a global problem and is a leading adversary of the United States. And I hope, sir, you've noticed that Iran and Russia and Iran and China are closer than they've been in a long, long time. Iran has provided drones to Putin that he's used to murder Ukrainian men, women, and children. And Russia is going to be sending advanced weapons to Iran. And I hope you saw the 25-year deal between Iran and China, where that involves technology, intelligence sharing, weapons development, military exercises, and Chinese money that's going to immunize the Islamic Republic of Iran from sanctions pressure. So what we're seeing develop here is an axis of aggressors that includes China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. I think it's fundamentally misguided to view Iran as some irrelevant, someone else's problem. This is an axis that's developing. America needs allies to respond, and Israel is our best ally in the Middle East for dealing with Iran.
Bradley Bowman, Center on Military and Political Power, Senior Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, more of your phone calls after the break in Open Forum. You can start calling us now and later. A conversation with Dr. Peniel Joseph, the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the University of Texas at Austin. We'll talk about the history and legacy of the 60th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We'll be back.
Today